All right, so I'm just going to quickly chat about Servant. I was hoping to proselytize this a bit further, but that's cool. No worries. Everyone can learn stuff. So what happens? One day you're sitting in your office and your boss is like, hey, we need a REST API. And you're like, okay, yeah, I can do that. No worries. And he's like, I need a JavaScript client. You're like, yeah, okay, I can do that. You're like, yep, I got this. I'm good. No worries. And then he says, well, can you also make a mock server while you're developing so then our UI folks can start working on stuff, at least testing things out? And he's like, can you make an Elm client? Because we just heard this at LambdaConf and we're going to use it. And he's like, how about C# stuff too for our legacy stuff? At this point, you're like, yeah, no, that's not really going to be happening anytime soon. So, but thankfully, you know of a friend who says, hey, let me tell you about Servant. It's really cool. So what Servant is it's pretty much allows you to express your web API, but in the type system. So what that means is you can pretty much have an API type that will then specify what your endpoints are, what their inputs are, and more importantly also is what their outputs are supposed to be. So for instance, in this first example, up here in this to-dos part, this one just goes and gets the to-dos, and it requires that the header host is present in the API, in the request. And it outputs a JSON object or a list of these d-to-do list of data types that you've specified. Subsequently, pretty much all the rest are more or less the same. Over here, we require a header. We say the request body is this patchy to-do, but it's the JSON data type. And then when we finish it, the response is going to be the data type of d-to-do. Pretty much the rest of them are more or less exactly the same. You can capture path parameters with this capture tag over here. And again, this entire thing is a type, which is pretty awesome. So, what's the big deal? The API types, the inputs and the outputs are typed. Just think about it just a second, right? Typically, all the other frameworks and libraries in more or less every language that I've ever used personally, you can have a request object, you can have a response object, then you can look inside them, you can do things, you can pull things out, and that's all sort of captured inside your function. It's not expressed at the top level where your function says, I have these requirements. It's always inside your function. So that you lose a lot of visibility into what your function's doing unless everyone's really meticulous about it and you capture only sort of the first part of the request, perhaps, in that function. You pass it off to another function that actually does the work with that. So you lose a lot of information about that. The nice thing, Haskell being Haskell, and the type system being pretty awesome, is that your inputs and outputs are compile time checked. So it means if you provide the implementation for it, the implementation must be able to take those request parameters and return the correct responding response types as well. So you can do really cool things with the Servant library, and it has other packages. You can pretty much pull a mock server out of thin air, provided you provide an arbitrary instance for your type class or your data types. So, kind of using quick checks, sort of generative arbitrary type class. And because it's typed, if you instantiate a few documentation-related type classes, the compiler will now force you to write documentation. Whether that's good or not, that's up to you, but it will force you to have some entry in the documentation for your data types. Also, just based on the types, Servant can generate a whole bunch of different language clients, including Haskell ones, and a bunch of other stuff. And you can actually generate a Swagger spec. So if you're not familiar with Swagger, what that allows you to do is sort of build up this YAML file, and you can punch this YAML file to a code generator, and that will generate different languages and frameworks and library implementations. So if you're not in a Python shop, but you need to generate a Python client, you can generate the Swagger spec from Servant, punch that into the Swagger generator, and then voila, you have a Python client. And in implementation, I left this off to the end, simply because it's not necessary that you implement anything. You can pretty much just have the type, and Servant can generate all those other things that we mentioned on the previous slide. So you don't actually have to implement squat if you don't want to, but you can if you want the rest of your API to be in Haskell, and then you pretty much just provide the implementation details.
So there is sort of difficulty there if you're not using the new generalized authentication stuff, I think. I've tried to build a few services with this, it works really well.
Yeah.
Up to that point, then you realize, oh shit, I'm probably actually going to need to have some authentication on a public web service.
Yeah.
That's very new now, I think.
Yeah, so what I've done is I've separated the authentication part from my actual application, and you can just do your auth part in Y if you want to, as another wrapper, or if your web server supports it. So I use this web server called Caddy, and so Caddy allows you to set up JSON web tokens, and it builds it in support into that. So then my API backend, all it receives are JWT headers that have already been decoded. The server decodes that for me, I just get it in the backend. So now I've separated the security mechanism from my backend service. Whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know. It just works for me. So, but yeah, they definitely did have authentication related issues in Server, and they still do. There's not really a generalized way of doing it.
Well, it kind of is. Aaron Levy? At least something, I don't know if it's familiar branch.
Yeah, like it's just security is so custom in every shop that it's hard to provide. They've provided a general mechanism, but doing it yourself is kind of hokey. It's not clean.
I think they need more examples at any rate.
Yeah. Speaking of examples, I will post a implementation of just to do example that I have. I'll put that on the room thing. So hope you guys learned something. Cool.